An elderly couple paid just $1,200 for a condemned casino everyone said was cursed. But what they discovered sealed inside the owner's secret vault wasn't just money. It was a forgotten empire worth $295 million. And the men who buried it were still alive, still watching, and still willing to kill to get it back. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The Nevada desert doesn't forgive. It bakes everything under its sun until the color bleeds out, until the hope dries up, until even the strongest dreams turn to dust. And in a little town called Baker's Flat, about 47 miles northeast of Las Vegas, that forgiveness had run out a long time ago. Harold and Edna Price had lived in Baker's Flat for 11 years now, ever since Harold's knees gave out and the hotel chain he'd worked for decided 40 years of loyal service wasn't worth a proper pension. They'd moved from their small house in Henderson to an even smaller apartment on the edge of town, a one-bedroom unit with carpet that smelled like the 1980s and windows that rattled every time the wind picked up, which in the desert was often. Harold was 78 years old. His hands were thick and scarred from decades of fixing things other people broke. Boilers, air conditioning units, plumbing disasters, electrical nightmares. He'd seen it all. He'd crawled through ceiling spaces at 3 in the morning. He'd been elbow-deep in sewage more times than he cared to remember. And he'd done it all without complaint because that's what men of his generation did. They worked, they provided, they kept their mouths shut and their hands busy. Edna was 76, with silver hair she still pinned up every morning like she was going somewhere important, even when she wasn't. She'd spent 31 years in school cafeterias, serving lunch to children who sometimes remembered to say thank you and often didn't. Her back ached from standing. Her feet had never fully recovered. But her eyes, those sharp blue eyes, still caught everything. 53 years they'd been married. 53 years of sharing a bed, a budget, and a belief that if you worked hard enough, life would eventually give you something back. It hadn't. Not really. Their savings account had dwindled to almost nothing. Social Security covered the rent most months, but the medical bills kept stacking up like accusations. Harold's blood pressure medication, Edna's arthritis treatment. The inhaler Harold needed when the desert dust got too thick. Every month felt like a negotiation with survival. But they had each other, and on the good days, that felt like enough. On the bad days, Harold would sit at the kitchen table after Edna fell asleep and stare at the numbers on their bank statement like they might rearrange themselves into something better. They never did. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when Harold first saw the flyer. He'd gone to the Baker's Flat Community Center to check on a leaky faucet for old Mrs. Patterson. He still did odd jobs around town when people asked, more for purpose than money. And there it was, pinned to the bulletin board between a missing cat poster and an advertisement for a church bake sale. Tax Lion Auction. Saturday, October 4th. Properties available starting at $500. Harold almost walked past it. He had no business looking at property auctions. He could barely afford the apartment they had. But something made him stop. Something made him lean in and read the list of available lots. Most of it was junk. Abandoned mobile homes. Empty lots filled with nothing but cactus and rattlesnakes. A few commercial buildings that had clearly seen better decades. And then, at the bottom of the list, 4 words that made his heart skip. The Silver Dust Casino. Starting bid, $1,200. Harold blinked, read it again. $1,200 for a casino. Even a condemned one seemed impossible. He tore the flyer off the board, stuffed it in his jacket pocket, and walked home faster than his knees wanted him to. Edna was in the kitchen when he burst through the door, peeling potatoes for that night's soup. She looked up, startled by the noise. "Harold, what on earth?" He slapped the flyer on the counter between them, breathing hard. "Look at this." Edna wiped her hands on her apron and picked up the paper. Her eyes scanned the list, then found the same line he had. "The Silver Dust," she said quietly. "That old place out on Route 15? That's the one. Harold, that building's been condemned for years. Everyone says it's falling apart, full of asbestos, probably got squatters living in it." "Probably," Harold agreed. "But Edna, $1,200. That's the starting bid. Nobody's going to want that place." She set the flyer down slowly. "And why would we want it?" Harold pulled out a chair and sat across from her. His voice dropped, the way it always did when he was about to say something he'd been thinking about for a long time. "Because we've got nothing to leave behind." Edna's expression softened. "We've got no house," Harold continued. "No land, no savings worth mentioning. When we're gone, what do our kids inherit? A box of photographs and some furniture from Goodwill?" "Harold, I know it sounds crazy. I know that building's probably worthless. But what if it isn't? What if there's something there we could salvage? Copper wiring, fixtures, building materials. I've torn apart enough buildings to know there's always something worth saving." Edna was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the flyer, then at her husband's face, at the hope there, fragile and stubborn. "How much do we have in savings?" she asked. 1,400 and change, maybe 1,500 if the last deposit cleared. She closed her eyes. "It's almost everything we've got." "I know. If we spend it on some falling-down casino and there's nothing there worth taking, then we're fools," Harold finished. "I know that too." Edna opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had when he'd proposed all those years ago in the parking lot of a diner in Reno, nervous and young and absolutely certain she was the only woman he'd ever love. "You really believe there's something there?" Harold hesitated. "I believe we deserve one more chance to try." The auction was held in the parking lot of the county courthouse, a squat building that looked as tired as everything else in Baker's Flat. About 30 people showed up, most of them investors or developers sniffing around for cheap land. They wore expensive watches and drove cars that still had shine on them. Harold and Edna stood near the back in their cleanest clothes, his only sport coat, her blue Sunday dress. They felt out of place. They were out of place. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a tan suit, worked through the list quickly. Mobile homes went for a few $100s each. Empty lots sold for slightly more. The commercial buildings sparked a few bidding wars, prices climbing into the tens of thousands. Then the auctioneer reached the last item. "Lot 47, he announced, shuffling his papers. "The Silver Dust Casino and Hotel, located at mile marker 15 on State Route 157. Approximately 32,000 square feet on 2.3 acres. Building is condemned, sold as is with no warranties, no inspections and no liability transfer. Starting bid is $1,200. He looked out at the crowd. Silence. A few people chuckled. Someone in the back muttered something about asbestos lawsuits. One of the developers shook his head and checked his phone. "Do I have 1,200? The auctioneer asked. More silence. Harold's hand went up. Every head in the parking lot turned to look at him. Edna felt her cheeks flush. The auctioneer squinted. "Sir, did you just bid 1,200? "I did." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Harold heard someone laugh, but he didn't look to see who. "Do I have 1,300? The auctioneer asked, scanning the crowd. Nothing. 1,300? Anyone? The developers looked at each other and shrugged. The investors had already moved on to their phones. "Going once at 1,200? Harold's heart pounded. "Going twice?" Edna gripped his arm so tight he felt her nails through his sleeve. "Sold to the gentleman in the back for $1,200. There was scattered applause, more mocking than congratulatory. As Harold made his way to the front to sign the paperwork, he heard whispers trailing behind him. "Poor old fool. Doesn't know what he's getting into. That place will eat him alive." Harold signed his name on the dotted line and handed over a check that represented almost everything they had left in the world. The county clerk gave him a large manila envelope containing the deed, the original blueprints, and a ring of keys so old they looked like they belonged in a museum. "It's yours now," the clerk said without enthusiasm. "Good luck." That Saturday afternoon, Harold and Edna drove out to see what they'd bought. The Silver Dust Casino sat alone at the edge of the highway, like something the desert was slowly swallowing. The parking lot was cracked and overtaken by weeds. The main sign, once bright with neon lights that spelled out the name in cursive, now hung crooked and dark, several letters missing entirely. The building itself was 2 stories of sun-bleached concrete and broken windows. Graffiti covered the lower walls. The front doors were boarded up with plywood that had warped and split over the years. Edna sat in the passenger seat of their old Buick, staring at the structure through the windshield. "Oh, Harold!" Her voice wasn't angry. It was something worse. It was sad. Harold didn't respond. He just opened his door and stepped out into the dry heat, keys clutched in his hand. The afternoon sun beat down on his shoulders as he approached the building. Up close, it looked even worse. Paint peeling, rust stains running down from every metal fixture. A smell that was equal parts mildew, animal waste, and years of neglect. But Harold had spent 40 years looking past surfaces to find the bones underneath. He'd fixed things that looked unfixable. He'd brought buildings back from worse than this. At least, that's what he told himself. He found the main entrance around the side, a heavy steel door with a padlock that had rusted nearly solid. It took him 15 minutes and 3 different keys before he found one that worked. The lock groaned open, and the door swung inward with a creak that echoed into darkness. The air inside was thick and stale. Harold clicked on his flashlight and stepped through. What he saw made him catch his breath. The main floor of the casino was still intact. Slot machines stood in rows like soldiers frozen mid-march, their screens dark, their chrome handles dull but present. Card tables sat beneath layers of dust, their green felt faded to grey. A long bar stretched across one wall, bottles still sitting on shelves behind it, labels yellowed with time. It was like walking into a photograph from another era. The place hadn't been looted or stripped. It had simply been sealed. "Edna," Harold called over his shoulder. "You need to see this." She appeared in the doorway, hesitant, one hand covering her nose against the smell. But when her eyes adjusted to the dim light, they went wide. "Good Lord," she whispered. They walked through the casino slowly, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The carpet squished under their feet. Water damage from somewhere, but the walls were solid. The ceiling, aside from a few sagging tiles, was holding. Harold's mind was already calculating. The slot machines alone, even broken, could fetch money from collectors. The bar fixtures were vintage. The furniture, if cleaned and restored, could sell to antique dealers. But it wasn't the main floor that interested him most. It was the inconsistencies. Harold had been studying the blueprints from the manila envelope since they'd gotten home from the auction. The original plans showed a standard casino layout: gaming floor, hotel rooms on the second level, kitchen, offices, storage. Nothing unusual. But as he walked the building now, something didn't add up. The walls were too thick. Several rooms that should have existed according to the blueprints weren't there at all. And in the back corner of the main floor, behind what used to be the cashier's cage, there was a door, a heavy door. Reinforced. With a lock Harold didn't recognize. "What's behind there?" Edna asked, coming up beside him. According to the plans, nothing. Just a utility closet. "That's a mighty big door for a utility closet." Harold ran his hand along the frame. The metal was cold, despite the desert heat outside. And at the base of the door, scratched deep into the concrete floor, were marks. Grooves. Like something heavy had been dragged through. Recently? Years ago? He couldn't tell. "Let's check the office," he said. "See what else we can find." The manager's office was on the second floor, accessible by a staircase that groaned under their weight but held. The room was small, cramped, with a desk buried under papers and a filing cabinet that had been left wide open. Edna started going through the desk while Harold examined the walls, knocking every few feet, listening for hollow spots. "Harold," Edna said quietly, "come look at this." She was holding a photograph, black and white, slightly faded but clear enough. It showed a group of men standing in front of the casino on what must have been opening day. A banner behind them read, "Grand Opening, 1968. In the center of the group stood a tall man with slicked back hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Harold made in a month back then. His arm was around another man, darker, broader, with a face like carved stone. On the back of the photo, someone had written a name, Victor Ashford and Friends. "Victor Ashford," Harold murmured. "I've heard that name before." Edna was already digging through more papers. She pulled out a newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle. The headline made them both go still. "Casino Mogul Vanishes. Foul Play Suspected." The date on the article was November 19, 1991. According to the story, Victor Ashford had disappeared without a trace. His car was found abandoned near the state line. There were signs of a struggle, but no body was ever recovered. Police suspected organized crime involvement but could never prove it. Ashford was declared legally dead 7 years later, and the Silver Dust? It had been shuttered immediately after his disappearance, locked up by courts tangled in legal battles over his estate. No one had claimed it. No one had wanted it. For 23 years it had sat here, rotting under the sun, holding its secrets. Edna looked at her husband. "Harold, what did we buy?" He didn't answer, because in his gut he was starting to wonder the same thing. They spent the next several days cleaning what they could, cataloguing what might be valuable, and trying to make sense of the building's strange layout. Harold hired a local teenager to help haul debris, paying him $20 a day, money they couldn't really afford but desperately needed the help. Every day, Harold found himself drawn back to that reinforced door behind the cashier's cage. He tried every key on the ring. None of them fit. He examined the lock with a magnifying glass borrowed from the library. It was custom, industrial, the kind of hardware you didn't find at a local store. "Whatever's behind that door," he told Edna one evening, "someone didn't want found. Maybe that's a sign we shouldn't find it." Harold looked at her. "Since when do we walk away from locked doors?" On the 7th day, Harold made a decision. He drove to the hardware store in the next town over and bought a heavy-duty pry bar, a sledgehammer, and a battery-powered angle grinder. The clerk raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. That afternoon, with Edna watching nervously from across the room, Harold went to work on the door. The hinges were reinforced, but they weren't invincible. It took him 2 hours and 3 broken drill bits, but finally, with a groan of protesting metal, the door gave way. Behind it was darkness. Not the dusty darkness of the rest of the casino, but something deeper, cooler. The air that rushed out smelled different, dry, sealed, preserved. Harold shined his flashlight through the opening. Stairs, leading down. "Harold," Edna said from behind him, "I don't like this." "Neither do I," he admitted. "But we didn't come this far to stop now." He descended slowly, one hand on the rough concrete wall for balance. The stairs were steep, built for function rather than comfort. After about 20 steps, he reached the bottom. It was a basement, larger than he expected, stretching out beyond the reach of his flashlight. He could see shapes in the darkness. Boxes, maybe. Equipment. He moved forward, sweeping the light across the walls. They were lined with wood paneling, strange for a basement, especially one that should have been used for storage or utilities. Then his flashlight caught something at the far end of the room. A glint. Metal. Harold's breath caught. He walked toward it, picking his way around scattered debris. The paneling on the back wall was warped, pulling away from whatever was behind it. He reached out and tugged. The wood crumbled in his hands, and behind it, flush against the concrete, was a vault door. Not a safe, not a lockbox. A vault, the kind you'd find in a bank, industrial steel, a combination dial in the center, untouched, unmoved, sealed for decades. Harold stood there, his heart hammering so loud he could hear it in his ears. His hands trembled as he reached out and touched the cold metal. "Edna!" His voice cracked as he shouted. "Edna, get down here! You need to see this!" He heard her footsteps on the stairs, slow and cautious. When she reached the bottom, he turned and pointed the flashlight at the wall. She gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Harold, what is this? What did we find?" He shook his head, still staring at the vault, at the dial that hadn't been turned in God knows how many years. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But whatever Victor Ashford was hiding, whatever got him killed, I think we just found it." They stood there together in the darkness, two elderly people who had spent their whole lives being overlooked, underestimated, forgotten by a world that had moved on without them. And now they stood before a sealed door that held secrets powerful men had buried, and perhaps killed to protect. The air in the basement was cold. The silence was absolute. Edna reached out and took Harold's hand. Her grip was strong despite her trembling. "What do we do now?" she asked. Harold looked at the vault, then at his wife, then back at the vault. "We open it," he said, "and we find out what was worth hiding all these years." Above them, the desert sun began to set, casting long shadows across the empty casino. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and deep beneath the earth, in a room that hadn't seen light in 23 years, an elderly couple stood on the edge of a discovery that would change everything. They just didn't know it yet. Harold didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed beside Edna, staring at the ceiling of their cramped apartment, listening to the rattle of the window frame and the distant hum of the highway. His mind kept returning to that vault door, the cold steel, the combination dial, the weight of decades pressing against it from the inside. What was in there? And more importantly, who had put it there? Edna stirred beside him, her breathing shallow. She wasn't sleeping either. "You're thinking about it," she said quietly. "Aren't you?" She rolled onto her side to face him. In the dim light filtering through the blinds, her face looked younger somehow, worried but alive. "I keep thinking about Victor Ashford," she admitted, "about what that newspaper article said. Foul play suspected. No body recovered." Harold nodded slowly. "Someone made him disappear, and whatever's in that vault, maybe that's why. Which means someone might still be looking for it." The thought hung between them like smoke. "We should call the police," Edna said. "Tell them what we found." "Tell them what? That we bought a condemned casino and found a locked door. They'll think we're crazy. Or worse, they'll take the whole thing and we'll never see a dime." "Harold, I'm not saying we keep it secret forever. I'm saying we need to know what's in there first. We need to understand what we're dealing with before we bring anyone else into this." Edna was quiet for a long moment. Then she sighed. "How do we even open it? That's not a padlock. That's a bank vault." Harold had been thinking about that too. "I've cracked safes before," he said. "Nothing that big, but the principle's the same. Combination locks have tolerances, weaknesses. If I can feel the mechanism, listen to the tumblers. You're 78 years old, Harold. And I've got 40 years of experience taking things apart." He turned to look at her. "Let me try. Give me 3 days. If I can't crack it, we call someone. Deal?" Edna studied his face for a long time. Then she reached out and touched his cheek. 3 days, she agreed. "But Harold, if this goes wrong, it won't." He hoped he was right. The next morning, Harold returned to the casino alone. Edna stayed home, partly to rest, partly to research Victor Ashford at the library. They'd agreed to divide and conquer. She'd dig into the past while he worked on the present. The basement was exactly as they'd left it, cold, dark, silent. The vault door gleamed dully in the beam of his flashlight, indifferent to his presence. Harold set down his toolbox and pulled out a stethoscope he'd borrowed from a retired doctor who owed him a favor. He'd also brought a notepad, a pencil, and more patience than he'd needed in years. He pressed the stethoscope to the vault door just beside the dial and began to turn. Click. He paused, wrote down the number, turned again. Click. Another number. This was going to take a while. By noon, he'd identified 3 possible contact points. By evening, he'd narrowed it down to a sequence of 5 numbers. His fingers ached, his back screamed at him, but he kept going. On the second day, he got closer. The dial moved with more purpose now, responding to his touch like an instrument he was slowly learning to play. On the third day, just as the afternoon sun was painting the desert orange through the broken windows upstairs, Harold entered the final number and felt something shift. A deep, mechanical thunk echoed through the basement. The vault door unsealed. Harold's hands trembled as he gripped the handle and pulled. The door was heavy, at least 300 pounds of solid steel, but it swung open smoothly, balanced on hinges that had been built to last forever. And then he saw what was inside. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The vault was larger than he'd expected, maybe 15 feet deep and 10 feet wide. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves, money, stacks and stacks of money, bundled in plastic wrap organized by denomination. Hundreds, 50s, 20s. More cash than Harold had ever seen in his life. More cash than he'd ever imagined existing in one place. But that wasn't all. On the floor, arranged in neat rows, were gold bars. Not coins, bars. Each one stamped with markings he didn't recognize. Foreign, maybe. There had to be 50 of them, maybe more. Against the back wall, a tall cabinet stood open, revealing safety deposit boxes, dozens of them, stacked 3 high. Harold approached slowly, almost reverently, and opened the first one. Jewelry, diamonds, emeralds, a ruby the size of his thumbnail, necklaces tangled with bracelets tangled with rings that sparkled even in the dim light of his flashlight. The second box held documents, bearer bonds, stock certificates, titles to properties Harold had never heard of. The third box held photographs, men in suits, handshakes in dark rooms, faces Harold didn't recognize but somehow knew were dangerous. He stepped back, overwhelmed. His legs gave out, and he sank onto a wooden crate near the entrance, staring at the fortune spread before him. This wasn't a safe, it wasn't a stash. It was an empire, hidden, forgotten, buried beneath a condemned casino for over 2 decades. "Oh my God," he whispered to no one. "Oh my God." He didn't know how long he sat there. Minutes, maybe an hour. The light outside faded from orange to purple to black before he finally moved. He closed the vault door carefully, making sure it sealed but didn't lock. Then he climbed the stairs on shaking legs, walked through the empty casino, and drove home in a daze. When he walked through the apartment door, Edna was waiting at the kitchen table. She had a stack of papers in front of her, printouts from the library, handwritten notes, photocopies of old newspaper articles. She looked up when he entered. "Harold, you look like you've seen a ghost." He sat down across from her. His mouth opened, but no words came out. "Harold, what happened? What was in the vault?" He took a deep breath. "Everything," he said finally. "Everything was in the vault." He told her. All of it. The money, the gold, the jewelry, the documents, the photographs. He described it in halting sentences, struggling to find words big enough to contain what he'd seen. When he finished, Edna was pale. "How much?" she whispered. "How much do you think is in there?" Harold shook his head. "I don't know. Millions. Maybe tens of millions. Maybe more." Edna looked down at her research, then back at him. "I found out more about Victor Ashford today," she said quietly. "He wasn't just a casino owner. According to these articles, the FBI suspected him of running one of the largest money laundering operations in the Southwest during the 1980s. Money laundering? Washing dirty money for organized crime. Drug cartels, mob families, anyone who needed cash to look legitimate. She pushed a photocopied article across the table. They investigated him for years but could never make anything stick. Witnesses disappeared, evidence went missing. Then in 1991, Ashford himself vanished. And the money was never found. Edna nodded slowly. Until now. They sat in silence, the weight of the discovery pressing down on them. "What do we do?" Edna asked finally. Harold rubbed his face with both hands. "I don't know, I really don't know. We could take some of it, just enough to pay off our debts, maybe buy a little house. No one would ever have to know." Harold looked at her. In 53 years of marriage, Edna had never suggested anything dishonest. She was the one who returned extra change at the grocery store. She was the one who insisted on paying taxes to the penny. But he understood. He felt it too. The temptation, the desperate, aching need for relief after so many years of scraping by. "If we take that money," he said slowly, "we become part of whatever Ashford was involved in. We tie ourselves to criminals, to murderers maybe." "We're 78 years old, Harold. Who's going to come after us?" Whoever killed Victor Ashford might still be out there. Whoever was waiting for that money to resurface. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Edna, we've never taken anything that wasn't ours. That's why we can still look each other in the eye after all these years. I don't want to lose that. Not now, not for any amount of money." Edna's eyes filled with tears. She squeezed his hand tightly. "Then what do we do?" Before Harold could answer, there was a knock at the door. They both froze. No one knocked on their door. They didn't have visitors. Their children lived in other states and called instead of coming by. The neighbors kept to themselves. Harold stood slowly. Edna gripped his arm. "Don't," she whispered. Another knock, louder this time. Harold walked to the door and looked through the peephole. A man stood in the hallway. Late 40s, maybe early 50s. Expensive suit, slicked back hair, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Something about him made Harold's skin crawl. He opened the door but kept the chain on. "Can I help you?" The man's smile widened. "Mr. Price? Harold Price?" "Who's asking?" "My name is Martin Cole. I'm a property consultant specializing in distressed real estate acquisitions." He pulled a business card from his pocket and held it up. "I understand you recently purchased the Silver Dust Casino." Harold's blood went cold. "How do you know that?" "Public records, Mr. Price. These things aren't hard to find if you know where to look." The smile never wavered. "I represent a group of investors who are very interested in that property. We'd like to make you an offer." "It's not for sale." "Everything's for sale, Mr. Price. It's just a matter of finding the right number." He leaned closer to the gap in the door. "How does 500,000 sound? Cash. No questions asked. We handle all the paperwork." Harold stared at him. $500,000. More money than he'd ever dreamed of having. But something was wrong. No one offered that kind of money for a condemned building worth $1,200 at auction. Not unless they knew something. "Like I said," Harold repeated, "it's not for sale." The man's smile flickered, just for a moment, just long enough for something cold and flat to show through. "I think you should reconsider, Mr. Price. That building has a complicated history. It would be a shame if that history caused you any difficulties." "Is that a threat?" "Just friendly advice." Martin Cole tucked his card back into his pocket. "Think about it. I'll be in touch." He turned and walked down the hallway, his footsteps fading into silence. Harold closed the door and locked it. Then he slid the deadbolt home and stood there, heart pounding. "Who was that?" Edna asked from behind him. "Trouble," Harold said quietly. That was trouble. That night, they didn't sleep at all. What happens next will test this couple in ways they never imagined, reveal secrets that powerful men have killed to protect, and prove that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The next morning, Harold called in a favor. He'd known Walter Brennan for almost 20 years. They'd met at a veterans support group back in Henderson. Walter had served in Korea, Harold in Vietnam. They'd bonded over shared silence and the understanding that some things didn't need to be spoken aloud. Walter had been a federal prosecutor before retiring, tax cases mostly, but he knew how the system worked. He knew which doors opened and which ones stayed locked. Harold called him at 9 in the morning. "Walter, it's Harold Price. I need your help." "Harold? Hell, I haven't heard from you in years. How's Edna?" "She's fine. We're both fine. Mostly." Harold paused. "Can we meet? Somewhere private? It's important." There was a long silence on the other end. "This about that casino you bought? Heard about that through the grapevine?" "Word travels fast. Small towns, you know how it is." Another pause. "There's a diner off Route 15 about 10 miles past Baker's Flat, Jenny's place. Meet me there at noon." "I'll be there." The diner was exactly the kind of place that time forgot. Red vinyl booths, a jukebox that still played quarters, a waitress who called everyone Hun and refilled coffee without being asked. Walter was already there when Harold arrived. He sat in the back booth facing the door, an old habit from his prosecuting days. His hair had gone white since they'd last met, but his eyes were still sharp. Harold slid into the seat across from him. "Thanks for coming. You sounded scared on the phone. I've never known you to be scared of anything." Walter leaned forward. "What's going on?" Harold took a deep breath. Then he told him everything. The auction, the casino, the locked door, the vault, the money, the gold, the documents. Martin Cole's visit. Walter listened without interrupting. His expression grew darker with each detail. When Harold finished, Walter sat back and let out a long, slow breath. "Jesus Christ, Harold. I know. You have any idea what you've stumbled into?" "That's why I called you." Walter rubbed his jaw, thinking. "Victor Ashford," he said slowly. "I remember that name. We never handled his case directly, but we knew about it. Everyone in federal law enforcement knew about it. The man was untouchable, had connections everywhere. Judges, politicians, law enforcement. Anyone who tried to build a case against him ended up reassigned or retired or what?" Walter looked at him grimly. "Or they disappeared, just like he did." Harold's stomach turned. "That money in your vault," Walter continued. "That's not just cash, that's evidence. Decades of criminal activity, money laundering, maybe worse. If what you're describing is accurate, you're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars in illicit assets." "Hundreds of millions? Gold alone at today's prices? Those bearer bonds, if they're still valid?" Walter shook his head. "Harold, you're sitting on a fortune, but you're also sitting on a bomb." "What do you mean?" "Whoever killed Ashford didn't do it for fun. They did it because they wanted what he had. That money, that gold, those documents. They've been looking for it for 23 years. Walter leaned forward. "And now some guy in an expensive suit shows up at your door offering $500,000 for a building worth $1,200? That's not a coincidence?" "So what do I do?" Walter was quiet for a long moment. "You have two choices. You can take the money and run, sell the property, disappear, hope they never find you." He shook his head. "But that won't work. These people don't forget. They don't forgive. They'll find you eventually." "And the other choice?" "You go to the FBI. You turn over everything, the vault, the documents, all of it. You become a witness. You cooperate fully. In exchange, you get protection. And maybe, just maybe, you get to keep a piece of what you found. Keep a peace? Walter nodded. There are laws about this. When civilians discover assets tied to criminal activity, sometimes there's a finder's fee, a percentage. It's not guaranteed, but it's possible. He paused. But Harold, you have to understand. The moment you go to the feds, your life changes. Forever. These people, whoever they are, they'll know you talked, and they'll come for you. Harold stared at his coffee. It had gone cold without him noticing. So either way, we're in danger. Either way, yes. But one path leads to justice. The other leads to running for the rest of your life. Harold thought about Edna, about the fear in her eyes last night, about 53 years of marriage built on honesty and hard work. I'm too old to run, he said quietly. Walter nodded slowly. Then you know what you have to do. When Harold got home, Edna was waiting in the kitchen. She looked like she hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't moved from that chair since he left. Well? She asked. Harold sat down across from her and took her hands. We're going to the FBI. Her eyes widened. Harold, listen to me. Walter says this money is connected to organized crime, to murders maybe. The people who are looking for it, they're not going to stop. That man who came to our door, he was just the beginning. But if we go to the authorities, then we're protected, we're on the right side, and there's a chance, a real chance, that we could get to keep some of what we found, legally. Edna's hands trembled in his. I'm scared, Harold. So am I. He squeezed her fingers. But we've never run from anything in our lives. We're not starting now. That night, strange things began happening. Around 8 o'clock, their phone rang. Harold answered. Silence. Hello? Nothing. Just the faint sound of breathing. He hung up. 10 minutes later it rang again. Same thing. Silence. Breathing. Click. The third time Harold didn't answer. Around 10, Edna noticed something through the window. A car parked across the street. Black sedan. Tinted windows. She'd never seen it before. Harold. He came to the window and looked. The car sat there, engine off, lights off, just watching. Go to bed, Harold said quietly. I'll keep an eye on it. He didn't sleep. He sat in the dark living room, watching that car through the blinds. It didn't move. No one got in or out. Around 3 in the morning, it finally drove away. The next day, their mail arrived opened. Every envelope had been carefully slit along the top and resealed. Harold could tell from the wrinkles in the paper the way the glue didn't quite sit right. Someone was reading their mail. That afternoon, a note appeared under their door. No envelope, no postmark, just a single piece of paper, folded once. Harold picked it up with shaking hands and read the typed words. What's buried should stay buried. Walk away. No signature, no threat, just those 7 words. Edna found him standing in the hallway staring at the note. What is it? He showed her. She went pale. Oh God, Harold, oh God. He crumpled the paper in his fist. Pack a bag, he said. We're leaving tonight. Leaving? Where? The FBI field office is in Las Vegas, 3 hours from here. We drive there tomorrow morning, first thing. But tonight, we're not staying here. We're going to a motel, somewhere off the highway, somewhere they won't think to look. Harold. He turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not fear, something harder, something that had been forged in jungles and firefights half a century ago. They think we're going to be scared. They think we're just 2 old people who don't know any better. His jaw tightened. They're wrong. Edna looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. I'll pack. They left at 9 that night, slipping out the back door with 2 small suitcases and a folder containing copies of everything they'd found. Harold had photographed the vault contents on an old digital camera. He'd made copies of the documents. He'd written down every detail he could remember. If something happened to them, the evidence would survive. They drove for an hour before stopping at a roadside motel called the Desert Star. It was the kind of place that asked no questions and accepted cash. Harold paid for 2 nights. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and old cigarettes. The mattress sagged in the middle. The television got 3 channels, all of them fuzzy, but it was safe. For now. Edna sat on the edge of the bed, looking smaller than Harold had ever seen her. "Are we doing the right thing?" she asked quietly. Harold sat beside her and put his arm around her shoulders. "I don't know if there is a right thing anymore," he admitted. "But there's an honest thing, and that's what we're doing." She leaned into him, and they sat like that for a long time, 2 old people holding on to each other in a strange room, waiting for morning. Outside, the desert stretched dark and silent in every direction. Somewhere out there, men with cold eyes and expensive suits were looking for them. But Harold and Edna weren't hiding. They weren't running. They were preparing, because tomorrow they would walk into the Las Vegas field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and they would tell their story. They would name names, show photographs, reveal the location of a fortune that had been buried for over 2 decades. And whatever came next, whatever dangers followed, they would face it together. The way they'd faced everything, for 53 years. Harold kissed the top of Edna's head. "Try to get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." She nodded against his shoulder. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance. The desert held its secrets close, but not for much longer. The sun was just rising when they checked out of the motel. Harold paid in cash again, leaving no paper trail, and they were on the highway by 6:30. The drive to Las Vegas took just under 3 hours. They didn't speak much. Edna watched the desert roll by, the Joshua trees and the distant mountains and the endless blue sky. Harold kept his eyes on the road and his mind on what lay ahead. The FBI field office was in a nondescript building on East Charleston Boulevard. Harold parked in the visitor lot and sat for a moment, hands still on the wheel. "You ready?" Edna asked. "No," he admitted, "but I'm going anyway." They walked through the front doors together, hand in hand. The lobby was cold and official. Fluorescent lights, government-issue furniture, a security guard who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Harold approached the front desk. "We need to speak to someone about a criminal matter," he said. "It involves organized crime, money laundering, possibly murder, and we have evidence." The receptionist looked at him like he'd just claimed to see a UFO. "Sir, do you have an appointment?" "No, but trust me, someone's going to want to hear what we have to say." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone. "Please have a seat. Someone will be with you shortly." They sat in the plastic chairs and waited. 20 minutes later, a door opened and a woman in a dark suit stepped out. She was maybe 40, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression. "Mr. and Mrs. Price." They stood. "I'm Special Agent Diana Reyes. I understand you have information about criminal activity." Harold nodded. "We have more than information. We have proof." Agent Reyes studied them for a moment. Whatever she saw in their faces must have convinced her, because she stepped aside and gestured toward the door. "Follow me." They walked down a long hallway, past offices and conference rooms, until they reached a small interview room with a table and 4 chairs. "Please sit," Agent Reyes said, "and tell me everything." So they did. Harold talked for almost 2 hours. He described the auction, the casino, the vault. He showed her the photographs on his camera. He laid out the copies of the documents, the bearer bonds, the property titles. Edna filled in the gaps. She explained the research she'd done on Victor Ashford, the newspaper articles, the federal investigations that had gone nowhere. Agent Reyes listened without interrupting. Her expression never changed, but her eyes grew wider with each new detail. When they finished, she sat back in her chair and exhaled slowly. "Mr. and Mrs. Price," she said carefully, "do you have any idea what you've found?" Harold shook his head. "That vault you're describing," Agent Reyes continued, "if even half of what you're telling me is accurate, It could be one of the largest seizures of criminal assets in the history of this field office. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars." "Hundreds of millions," Edna repeated quietly. "The men who hid that money," Agent Reyes said, "they're not going to let it go without a fight. You said someone already came to your door, offered you money." "$500,000, Harold confirmed, "for a building worth $1,200. That means they know. They don't know exactly what you found, but they know you found something, and they're testing you, seeing if you'll take a payoff and disappear." "We're not going anywhere," Harold said firmly. Agent Reyes studied him for a long moment. Then, for the first time, she smiled. "Good, because we're going to need your help." She stood and walked to the door. "Wait here. I need to make some calls. This just became a federal priority." The door closed behind her, and Harold and Edna sat alone in the interview room. Edna reached over and took his hand. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." Harold squeezed her fingers. "We did," he agreed. "But this is just the beginning. You know that, right?" She nodded slowly. "I know. But at least now we're not alone." Outside the window, Las Vegas sprawled in the morning light. Somewhere out there, men in expensive suits were making phone calls, rearranging plans, preparing for a fight. But in this small room, two elderly people sat hand in hand, ready for whatever came next. They had nothing left to lose, and everything to fight for. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of activity that Harold and Edna could barely comprehend. Within 2 hours of their interview with Special Agent Diana Reyes, the small conference room had become a command center. Agents came and went, carrying files and laptops. Phones rang constantly. Someone brought in a whiteboard covered in photographs, names, and red connecting lines. Harold and Edna sat in the corner, largely forgotten, watching the machinery of federal law enforcement spring to life around them. "This is really happening," Edna whispered. Harold nodded slowly. "It really is." By evening, a team of 12 agents had been assembled. Forensic accountants, organized crime specialists, evidence technicians, even a historian who specialized in cold cases from the 1980s and 90s. Agent Reyes briefed them all behind closed doors, then emerged with a look of grim determination. "Mr. and Mrs. Price," she said, approaching their corner. "We're moving on the casino tonight. I need you to come with us. You're the only ones who know exactly where the vault is and how to access it." Harold stood, his knees protesting. "We'll show you everything." "There's one more thing." Agent Reyes hesitated. "Given the threats you've already received, we're placing you under federal protection effective immediately. You won't be returning to your apartment." Edna's face went pale. "For how long?" "As long as necessary. These people, whoever they are, they've been looking for this money for over 2 decades. They're not going to stop just because the FBI is involved." She paused. "In fact, that might make them more desperate." Harold reached for Edna's hand. "We understand." They rode to the casino in a black SUV, sandwiched between 2 agents who never spoke. More vehicles followed behind, a convoy of federal power descending on the forgotten stretch of highway where the silver dust had stood empty for 23 years. The building looked different at night. The broken windows reflected the headlights of the convoy like hollow eyes. The faded sign creaked in the wind. Shadows pooled in corners where Harold's flashlight had once been the only source of light. Now the place was flooded with portable floodlights. Generators hummed. Agents in tactical gear secured the perimeter, while evidence technicians in white suits prepared their equipment. Harold led them inside, through the main floor with its rows of dead slot machines, past the cashier's cage, to the reinforced door that led to the basement. "Down here," he said. Agent Reyes went first, flashlight in hand. Harold followed, then Edna, then a stream of agents that seemed to never end. When they reached the vault, Agent Reyes stopped. "My God," she breathed. The door stood open, just as Harold had left it. The light from a dozen flashlights swept across the interior, illuminating the stacks of cash, the rows of gold bars, the cabinets full of jewelry and documents. An evidence technician let out a low whistle. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I've never seen anything like this." The cataloguing began immediately. Teams worked through the night, photographing everything, documenting every bill and bar and bond. Harold watched from a distance as his discovery transformed from a personal secret into federal evidence. By dawn, they had a preliminary count. Agent Reyes found Harold and Edna sitting on a crate near the stairs, exhausted but unable to sleep. "We're still tallying," she said, "but here's what we know so far. Cash, approximately $47 million in various denominations. Gold, 63 bars, current market value around $31 million. Bearer bonds and securities, face value of roughly $112 million, though some may be expired or worthless. Jewelry and artwork still being assessed, but early estimates suggest another 40 to 50 million. Harold's head spun. "That's approximately 240 to 250 million, Agent Reyes confirmed. "And we haven't finished with the documents yet. There are property deeds, offshore account information, records of transactions going back to the early 1980s. This isn't just money, Mr. Price. This is a complete financial history of one of the largest criminal enterprises in the Southwest." Edna clutched Harold's arm. $250 million, give or take. Agent Reyes's expression was serious. "Which brings me to my next point. The people who hid this money, the people who have been looking for it all these years, they're not going to let this go. We've already identified the man who came to your apartment, Martin Cole, real name, Martin Coletti. He's connected to the Sorrento crime family out of Phoenix." "Crime family," Harold repeated. "The Sorrentos have been trying to locate Ashford's hidden assets since he disappeared in 1991. We believe they were his partners in the money laundering operation. When Ashford went missing, so did their investment." Agent Reyes paused. "Now they know someone found it, and they know it's you." The safe house was a 3-bedroom ranch on the outskirts of Henderson, surrounded by a fence and monitored by agents in shifts around the clock. Harold and Edna arrived just as the sun was setting on their second day of federal protection. The house was comfortable enough, clean, furnished, stocked with groceries, but it wasn't home. Edna wandered from room to room, touching the unfamiliar furniture, looking out windows at a neighborhood she didn't recognize. "I don't even have my photographs," she said quietly. "My mother's recipes, our wedding album. It's all back at the apartment." Harold put his arm around her. "We'll get it back. This is temporary." "Is it?" She looked at him with tired eyes. "They said it could be months, maybe longer." "Then it's months." He kissed her forehead. "We've survived worse." But the truth was, they hadn't. In 53 years of marriage, they'd faced plenty of hardships, job losses, health scares, the deaths of parents and friends. But they'd never faced anything like this. Never been hunted, never been hidden away like witnesses in a crime movie. The first week was the hardest. They weren't allowed to contact anyone, not their children, not their neighbors, not even Walter Brennan, who had helped set this all in motion. Agent Reyes explained that any communication could be monitored, traced, used to locate them. "The Sorrentos have resources," she said. "Police contacts, private investigators. We can't take any chances." So Harold and Edna sat in their borrowed house, watching news coverage of their own discovery unfold on television. Elderly couple uncovers hidden fortune in condemned casino. FBI seizes hundreds of millions in assets linked to 1991 disappearance. Organized crime connections suspected in decades-old mystery. Their names were kept out of the reports, at least for now. The FBI had managed to keep their identities sealed, citing witness protection. But Harold knew it was only a matter of time before someone talked, before some reporter dug deep enough to find the truth, and then everyone would know. The investigation expanded rapidly. Agent Reyes visited them every few days with updates, each one revealing new layers of the criminal enterprise that Victor Ashford had built and hidden. "We've traced funds to accounts in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands and Panama," she reported during one visit. Ashford wasn't just laundering money for the Sorrentos. He was skimming from them, building his own empire on the side. "That's why they killed him," Harold said. "We believe so. The documents you found include ledgers showing discrepancies, money that came in from the Sorrentos but never went back out, millions of dollars over nearly a decade." Agent Reyes shook her head. "Ashford was stealing from the mob. When they figured it out, they made him disappear, but they never found where he'd hidden the money. Until we bought the casino." "Exactly." Agent Reyes paused. "There's something else. We've identified several of the men in those photographs you found. One of them is Vincent Sorrento, current head of the family. He would have been in his 30s when those pictures were taken." "He's still alive?" "Very much so, and very much interested in recovering what he considers his family's property." The legal proceedings began in late November. Harold and Edna were brought to the federal courthouse in Las Vegas under heavy security. They entered through a back door, flanked by agents, and were escorted to a courtroom already filled with lawyers, officials, and observers. The hearing was complex, a tangled web of federal asset forfeiture laws, state property rights, and criminal restitution statutes. Harold understood maybe a third of what was being discussed. Edna understood less. But Walter Brennan had come out of retirement to help, and he sat beside them, translating the legal jargon into plain English. "The government wants to seize everything," he explained quietly. "They're arguing that the assets are proceeds of criminal activity and therefore subject to forfeiture." "But we bought the property legally," Harold protested. "We own that building. Whatever was inside it should belong to us." "That's exactly what we're arguing." Walter nodded toward the front of the courtroom, where a young attorney was making their case. "Under Nevada law, property owners have rights to abandoned assets found on their land. There's precedent here. The question is whether those rights apply when the assets are connected to criminal activity." The proceedings stretched over weeks, then months. Meanwhile, the FBI's investigation continued. Arrests were made. Martin Colletti, two of his associates, a corrupt county official who had been paid to keep the casino's records buried in bureaucracy for decades, and then came the biggest arrest of all. Harold and Edna were watching the evening news when the story broke. Organized crime boss arrested in connection with 1991 murder. The screen showed Vincent Sorrento being led out of a Phoenix mansion in handcuffs. He was 74 years old now, white-haired and stooped, but his eyes were still cold, still dangerous. Federal prosecutors have charged Vincent Sorrento with conspiracy to commit murder in the 1991 disappearance of casino owner Victor Ashford, the anchor announced. The charges stem from evidence discovered in a sealed vault beneath the Silver Dust Casino, which was purchased earlier this year by an elderly couple at a tax auction. Edna grabbed Harold's arm. "They mentioned us." "They didn't say our names." "Not yet." Her voice was small. "But they will." She was right. 3 days later, a reporter from the Las Vegas Review-Journal published a story identifying Harold and Edna Price as the couple who had purchased the Silver Dust Casino and discovered the hidden vault. The story included their names, their ages, their previous address, and photographs apparently taken from the apartment building's security camera. The article was shared thousands of times. Interview requests flooded in. News vans began circling the safe house, though the agents managed to keep them at bay. "I'm sorry," Agent Reyes said when she visited. "We tried to keep your identities protected, but someone leaked. We're investigating." "It doesn't matter now," Harold said wearily. "The whole world knows." The publicity changed everything. Suddenly, Harold and Edna weren't just witnesses. They were celebrities. The story had captured the public imagination. two ordinary people, struggling on a fixed income, who had stumbled upon a fortune that crime bosses had been seeking for over 20 years. It was the kind of tale that movies were made of. And with the publicity came pressure. The Sorrento family's lawyers filed motions arguing that the assets rightfully belonged to their clients. Victims of Ashford's various schemes came forward demanding restitution. The state of Nevada claimed a portion under tax laws. The federal government insisted on its right to seize criminal proceeds. The courtroom battles grew fiercer. But Harold and Edna had something their opponents didn't expect: public sympathy. Letters poured in from across the country. Strangers sent cards and small gifts. A GoFundMe page someone had set up without their permission raised over $200,000 in a week. People saw themselves in Harold and Edna, working-class folks who had played by the rules their whole lives, who deserved a break for once. Walter Brennan used that sympathy strategically. "Public opinion matters," he told Harold during a break in proceedings. "Judges read the newspapers too. They know what people are thinking, and right now, everyone's rooting for you." The final hearing came on a cold morning in February. Harold and Edna sat in the front row, dressed in their best clothes, the same sport coat and blue dress they'd worn to the auction nearly 6 months ago. The courtroom was packed. Cameras waited outside. The whole world seemed to be watching. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Margaret Chen, took her seat and called the proceedings to order. "This court has carefully considered all claims to the assets discovered at the Silver Dust Casino property," she began. "The legal questions are complex, involving federal forfeiture statutes, state property law, and criminal restitution requirements." She spent the next hour summarizing the arguments, the precedents, the competing interests. Harold's head ached from trying to follow it all. Then she reached her conclusions. "With respect to the federal government's forfeiture claim," Judge Chen said, "the court finds that a substantial portion of the assets are indeed proceeds of criminal activity and are therefore subject to seizure. However, the court also finds that Mr. and Mrs. Price purchased the property in good faith, with no knowledge of its contents, and are entitled to consideration under Nevada's abandoned property statutes." Harold felt Edna's hand tighten on his. "Accordingly, the court orders the following distribution: federal seizure, $143 million in cash, securities, and criminal proceeds. Victim restitution fund, $72 million to be distributed among verified victims of Mr. Ashford's criminal enterprises. State of Nevada tax claim, $33 million. Harold did the math in his head. That was almost all of it. His heart sank. "And finally," Judge Chen continued, "the court recognizes the legitimate property rights of Harold and Edna Price. As the legal owners of the Silver Dust Casino and its contents, they are entitled to any assets not otherwise subject to forfeiture or restitution claims." She paused and looked directly at them. "The court hereby awards Harold and Edna Price the sum of $47 million, representing their share of the discovered assets." The courtroom erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Lawyers on all sides began talking at once. But Harold and Edna sat perfectly still, holding hands, trying to process what they'd just heard. $47 million. After a lifetime of scraping by, of counting pennies, of choosing between medications and groceries. $47 million. Edna's eyes filled with tears. Harold pulled her close. "We did it," he whispered. "We actually did it." Outside the courthouse, the steps were crowded with reporters and cameras. Agent Reyes and her team formed a protective barrier as Harold and Edna emerged, blinking in the winter sunlight. Questions flew at them from every direction. "Mr. Price, how does it feel to be a millionaire?" "Mrs. Price, what will you do with the money? Were you ever afraid for your lives? Do you have a message for the Sorrento family?" Harold raised his hand, and slowly the crowd quieted. "We don't have much to say," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "We're just two old people who bought a building no one else wanted. We didn't go looking for this. We didn't ask for any of it." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "But we also didn't run, and we didn't hide. When we found what was in that vault, we could have taken the money and disappeared, could have kept our mouths shut and lived comfortably. No one would have known." His jaw tightened. "But that's not who we are. That's not how we were raised. We spent our whole lives working honest jobs, paying our taxes, doing right by our neighbors, and when the time came to make a choice, we chose the same way we've always chosen. We told the truth." Edna stepped forward, her voice steadier than Harold expected. "People keep asking what we're going to do with the money," she said, "and the answer is simple. We're going to remember where we came from." She smiled, and in that smile was 53 years of partnership, of struggle, of love that had survived everything life had thrown at it. "We're going to remember what it feels like to have nothing, and we're going to make sure our family, our community, and people like us have something to hold on to." The crowd was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. Then another. Then another. The applause built until it echoed off the courthouse walls, drowning out the traffic and the wind and everything else. Harold and Edna stood together on those steps, hand in hand, bathed in winter light. They had walked into this courthouse 6 months ago as witnesses. They walked out as something else entirely. Not celebrities, not millionaires, not heroes exactly. Just two people who had refused to be silent when it mattered most. And in a world that so often rewarded the loudest voices, the most aggressive tactics, the most ruthless ambitions, that quiet refusal meant everything. The drive back to Henderson was quiet. Agent Reyes sat in the front seat, typing on her phone. Harold and Edna sat in the back, still processing what had happened. $47 million. It didn't feel real. It probably wouldn't feel real for weeks, maybe months, maybe ever. "What happens now?" Harold asked finally. Agent Reyes looked up from her phone. "Now we start the process of releasing the funds. It'll take some time, paperwork, tax assessments, that sort of thing, but you should have access to the money within 60 to 90 days. And the protection detail?" "The Sorrentos are in custody. Their organization is in disarray. We don't believe you're in immediate danger anymore." She paused. "But we'll keep agents nearby for the next few weeks, just to be safe. And you have my direct number if anything concerns you." Edna nodded slowly. "Can we go home? Back to our apartment?" Agent Reyes smiled. "Mrs. Price, with $47 million, I think you can go anywhere you want." Edna laughed. A real laugh, the first one Harold had heard from her in months. "I just want my photographs," she said. "My mother's recipes, our wedding album." "Then let's go get them." They drove to the apartment complex as the sun was setting. The building looked exactly the same, tired, faded, forgettable. But something had shifted in how Harold saw it. This place had been their home for 11 years. They'd struggled here, worried here, wondered if they'd die here with nothing to show for their lives. Now they were coming back as something else entirely. As they walked through the front door of their unit, Edna let out a long breath. "It's so small," she said softly. "I never noticed how small it was." Harold looked around at the cramped living room, the tiny kitchen, the window that still rattled when the wind blew. "We were happy here," he said. "We were surviving here." Edna picked up a framed photograph from the shelf, their wedding day, both of them young and hopeful and completely unaware of what life had in store. "There's a difference." She was right, Harold realized. There was a difference. They'd spent so long just trying to get by that they'd forgotten what it felt like to actually live. But now, for the first time in decades, they had choices. Real choices. And tomorrow they would start making them. That night, lying in their own bed for the first time in weeks, Harold stared at the ceiling while Edna slept beside him. $47 million. He still couldn't wrap his mind around it. The number was too big, too abstract. It belonged in newspaper headlines and bank commercials, not in the life of a retired maintenance man from Nevada. But it was real, and it came with responsibilities. He thought about their children, Marcus in Seattle, Linda in Chicago, both of them struggling in their own ways. Mortgages, student loans for the grandkids, medical bills. He thought about their grandchildren, 4 of them now, ranging from 8 to 19. What kind of future could $47 million build for them? He thought about their community. The other seniors in the apartment complex, living on fixed incomes just like they had been. The local food bank that was always short on donations. The library that had cut its hours because of budget problems. And he thought about Victor Ashford, about the money that had been stolen, the lives that had been ruined, the blood that had been spilled in the name of greed. That fortune had been built on suffering. Harold was determined to rebuild it on something better. The next morning, he woke Edna with a cup of coffee and a legal pad covered in handwritten notes. "What's all this?" she asked, sitting up in bed. "Ideas." He sat beside her. "I couldn't sleep, so I started making a list." She took the pad and read through it, her eyebrows rising with each item. College funds for the grandchildren. Pay off Marcus and Linda's mortgages. Donate to the food bank. Create a scholarship at my old high school. She looked up. "Harold, this is wonderful." "There's more." He took her hand. "I was thinking about what you said yesterday, about remembering where we came from." She nodded. These people, the ones who were searching for that money all these years, they thought it would make them powerful, make them untouchable. His jaw tightened. But all it did was destroy them. Ashford's dead. The Sorrentos are going to prison. Everyone who touched that fortune ended up broken. "And us?" Harold smiled. "We're going to be different. We're going to take the worst thing that ever came from that money and turn it into the best thing we can." Edna's eyes glistened. She set down the legal pad and pulled him close. "I love you, Harold Price." "I love you too, Edna." They sat together in the morning light, holding each other, planning a future neither of them had ever imagined possible. Outside, the desert stretched toward the horizon, vast and ancient and indifferent to human dreams. But inside that small apartment, 2 ordinary people were dreaming anyway, dreaming of the good they could do, the lives they could change, the legacy they could leave behind. They had walked into darkness and found a fortune. They had faced down criminals and survived. They had stood before judges and told the truth. And now, finally, they were ready to live. Not just survive, live, the way they'd always deserved to, the way everyone deserves to, with hope, with purpose, with love, and with the knowledge that sometimes, if you're brave enough to open a door that everyone else is afraid of, you might just find something worth fighting for on the other side. The morning after the verdict, Harold woke before dawn. He lay still for a moment, listening to Edna's soft breathing beside him, watching the first grey light filter through the blinds of their small apartment. $47 million. The number still felt foreign, like a word in a language he didn't speak. He slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake her, and padded to the kitchen in his worn slippers. The coffee maker, the same one they'd had for 15 years, the one that took forever to brew and made a sound like a dying cat, gurgled to life as he pressed the button. $47 million, and he was still using a coffee maker held together with duct tape and prayer. He smiled at that. The truth was, Harold didn't want a new coffee maker. He didn't want a mansion or a sports car or any of the things people assumed he'd rush out to buy. He wanted exactly what he had, Edna beside him, a roof over his head, and the knowledge that tomorrow was taken care of. But he also knew that $47 million came with responsibilities, expectations, decisions that would ripple outward for generations. He poured his coffee and sat at the kitchen table with his legal pad, reviewing the notes he'd made the night before. The list had grown longer overnight. his handwriting cramped and urgent in the margins. College funds for the grandchildren. Pay off Marcus and Linda's mortgages. Set up a trust for medical emergencies. Donate to the Baker's Flat Food Bank. Create a scholarship for trade school students. Help the seniors in the apartment complex. Fund the library's extended hours program. Establish something permanent. A foundation, maybe. The last item was circled twice. A foundation. Harold had been thinking about it since the courthouse steps, since Edna said they would remember where they came from. A foundation could outlive them both. It could keep doing good long after they were gone. But first, there were simpler things to address. The phone calls started at 7 in the morning. First was Marcus, their son in Seattle. He'd seen the news, of course. Everyone had.
"Dad, what the hell is going on? Are you okay? Mom okay? I've been trying to reach you for weeks."
"We're fine, son. We're both fine." Harold took a deep breath. "We couldn't contact anyone. Federal protection. It's a long story." "Federal protection?" Marcus's voice cracked. "Dad, the news is saying you found $250 million in a basement. They're saying organized crime. They're saying the news is mostly right for once." Harold glanced toward the bedroom where Edna was starting to stir. "Look, Marcus, I know this is a lot, but we're safe now. The bad guys are in custody, and we came out okay." "Okay? Dad, they're saying you got $47 million. Is that true?" Harold paused. "It's true." Silence on the other end, then very quietly, "Holy shit." Linda called 20 minutes later. Then the grandchildren, one by one, their voices a mixture of excitement and disbelief and concern. By 9 in the morning, Harold's ear was sore from pressing the phone against it. Edna finally rescued him, taking over the calls while he escaped to the bathroom for a shower that lasted longer than any he'd taken in years. When he emerged, she was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, looking thoughtful. "Marcus wants to fly out," she said. "I figured he would." "Linda too, and the grandchildren are beside themselves." She smiled faintly. "Little Emma asked if we were going to buy a castle." Harold laughed. "What did you tell her?" "I told her Grandpa was thinking about it, but Grandma wanted a garden instead." They looked at each other across the small kitchen, and something passed between them. An understanding. A shared recognition of how surreal this all was, and how important it was to stay grounded. "We should get a lawyer," Edna said. "A real one. Not Walter. He's been wonderful, but this is beyond his expertise." Harold nodded. "And an accountant, and probably a financial advisor. And a new coffee maker." He grinned. "Let's not get crazy." The first major decision came 3 weeks later. They'd spent the time getting their affairs in order. A team of lawyers and financial advisors had been assembled, people who specialized in managing large estates, who came recommended by Agent Reyes and vetted by Walter Brennan. The money had been transferred into a series of accounts carefully structured to minimize taxes and maximize security. And then came the question everyone had been asking: where would they live? Realtors had been calling non-stop since the verdict. Luxury homes in Las Vegas, penthouses in California, beachfront properties in Florida, estates in Arizona with pools and tennis courts, and more bedrooms than they could count. Harold and Edna listened politely to each pitch, looked at the glossy photographs, and said no to every single one. "I don't understand," one particularly persistent realtor said. "You could afford any house in the state, any house in the country. Why stay in Nevada?" Edna smiled patiently. "Because this is home." They ended up buying a 3-bedroom ranch about 10 miles from their old apartment complex. It wasn't fancy. No pool, no tennis court, no guest house. Just a solid brick home with a big backyard, a 2-car garage, and a kitchen with enough counter space for Edna to actually spread out while she cooked. The price was $470,000, less than 1% of their fortune. The realtor looked at them like they'd lost their minds. "Are you sure?" she asked.
For what you're spending, you could have—
We're sure, Harold said firmly. They moved in on a Saturday in early March. Marcus flew out to help, along with his wife and their 2 teenagers. Linda came from Chicago with her husband and their daughter. For the first time in years, the whole family was together. The house felt full in a way their apartment never had. Voices echoed off the walls. Children ran through the rooms, claiming bedrooms for future visits. Edna stood in her new kitchen, tears streaming down her face as she watched her grandchildren argue over who got to pick the first movie on the new television.
You okay?
Harold asked, coming up beside her. She nodded, wiping her eyes. I never thought I'd see this. All of us, together, in our own home. Harold put his arm around her. Get used to it. This is just the beginning. That evening, after the kids had gone to bed and the adults were scattered around the living room, Harold cleared his throat. There's something we need to talk about, he said, as a family. Marcus straightened in his chair. Linda set down her wine glass. Even the in-laws leaned forward. Your mother and I have been doing a lot of thinking, Harold continued, about what to do with this money, and we've made some decisions. He pulled out a folder and opened it on the coffee table.
First, we're paying off both your mortgages. Marcus, Linda, you'll own your homes free and clear by the end of the month.
Marcus's mouth fell open. Linda burst into tears. Second, we're setting up college funds for each of the grandchildren. Full tuition, room and board, books, whatever they need. If they want to go to trade school instead, that's covered too. We're not going to dictate their paths. Edna smiled. We just want to make sure the doors are open. Harold continued. Third, we're creating a family emergency fund. If anyone has a medical crisis, a job loss, anything that threatens their stability, the money will be there. No questions asked, no strings attached. The room was silent. Everyone was staring at them. And finally, Harold said, we're establishing a foundation, the Price Family Foundation. It will fund scholarships, support community programs, and help people who are struggling the way we struggled for so many years. He looked around at his children, his grandchildren, his family. We didn't earn this money, he said quietly. We found it. And it came from some very dark places. But we have a chance to turn it into something good, something that outlasts all of us. Marcus was the first to speak. Dad, I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Harold smiled. Just help us do it right. The next several months were the busiest of Harold and Edna's lives. The foundation required endless paperwork. Articles of incorporation, tax filings, board appointments, grant structures. They hired an executive director, a woman named Rachel, who had spent 20 years running nonprofits and understood exactly what they were trying to build. Most people who come into sudden wealth want to protect it, Rachel told them during their first meeting. They build walls around their money. You two are doing the opposite. You're building bridges. Bridges are more useful, Edna said simply. The first grants went out in June. 5 scholarships for students at the local community college, each worth $25,000 per year. The recipients were chosen based on financial need and commitment to their communities. Single mothers returning to school, veterans transitioning to civilian careers, young people who had grown up in the same circumstances Harold and Edna knew so well. The announcement ceremony was held in the college auditorium. Harold and Edna sat in the front row, watching as 5 nervous young people walked across the stage to receive their awards. One of them, a woman in her 30s named Maria, stopped at the microphone. I don't have a big speech prepared, she said, her voice trembling, but I want to say thank you to Mr. and Mrs. Price. 6 months ago, I was working 2 jobs and still couldn't afford my tuition. I was about to drop out, and now, she wiped her eyes, now I have a chance, a real chance, and I'm not going to waste it. Edna reached for Harold's hand. He squeezed it tightly. This, he thought, this is what the money is for. The foundation grew quickly. By the end of the first year, they had funded 37 scholarships, donated $200,000 to local food banks, and established a grant program for small businesses in underserved communities. They'd also partnered with the public library to extend its hours and expand its children's programs. But the project that meant the most to Harold was the one that came last. He called it the Tradesmen's Guild. It was a vocational training program for young people who weren't interested in traditional college. Kids who wanted to work with their hands, who learned by doing rather than reading. The program covered everything from automotive repair to electrical work to plumbing, with paid apprenticeships and job placement assistance. Harold taught some of the classes himself. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, he drove to the community center and spent 3 hours with a group of teenagers, showing them how to diagnose an engine problem, how to read a wiring diagram, how to approach a repair with patience and precision. "You're 79 years old," Edna pointed out one evening. "You don't have to do this yourself." "I know I don't have to." He smiled. "I want to." And he did. Watching those young faces light up when something clicked, when a skill they'd struggled with suddenly made sense, it reminded him of why he'd loved this work in the first place. Not for the money, not for the recognition, but for the satisfaction of making something broken work again. The 1-year anniversary of the court verdict fell on a Tuesday. Harold and Edna marked it quietly, with dinner at the same diner where they'd celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, a little place called Rosie's that served meatloaf and mashed potatoes and pie that tasted like somebody's grandmother had made it. 1 year, Edna said, stirring her coffee. "Can you believe it's been a whole year?" Harold shook his head. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago." "Do you ever regret it, going to the FBI instead of just keeping it quiet?" He thought about the question seriously. It deserved a serious answer. "No," he said finally, "not for a second. Even with everything that happened, the threats, the safe houses, the trial, even with all of that," he reached across the table and took her hand. "Edna, we spent our whole lives doing things the right way, working hard, being honest, and for a long time it felt like none of it mattered, like the world didn't care about people like us." She nodded slowly. "But then this happened, and we had a choice. We could have become part of the problem, taken the money and pretended we didn't know where it came from, or we could stay who we've always been." He squeezed her fingers. "I couldn't look at myself in the mirror if we'd done anything different." Edna's eyes glistened. "I love you, Harold Price." "I love you too, Edna." The waitress brought their pie, apple for him, cherry for her, and they ate in comfortable silence, 2 old people in a corner booth, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of a small-town diner. Outside, the sun was setting over the desert. Another day ending, another year behind them. But so many more ahead. The second year brought changes none of them had anticipated. In April, Marcus announced that he was leaving his job in Seattle. He and his family were moving to Nevada to help run the foundation full-time. "Are you sure?" Harold asked when Marcus told him. "You've got a good career up there, a whole life." "I've got a good paycheck up there," Marcus corrected. "But what you and Mom are building here, that's a life. That's something that matters, and I want to be part of it." Linda couldn't relocate. Her husband's job kept them in Chicago, but she joined the foundation's board and flew out quarterly for meetings. The grandchildren, meanwhile, had become unofficial ambassadors, telling their friends about the programs and volunteering during school breaks. It had become a family mission, a shared purpose that connected them across distances and generations. The foundation's impact continued to grow. They funded the construction of a new community center in Baker's Flat, replacing the crumbling building where Harold had first seen the auction flyer. The new center had a gym, a computer lab, meeting rooms, and a kitchen for community meals. The grand opening was held on a Saturday in September. The whole town seemed to turn out. More people than Harold had ever seen gathered in one place in Baker's Flat. A local band played country music. Children ran through the parking lot. The smell of barbecue drifted on the warm air. The mayor asked Harold to cut the ribbon. He stood there with giant ceremonial scissors, looking out at the crowd of familiar faces. People he'd known for years. Neighbors, friends. People who had once looked at him with pity. The old man who couldn't afford to fix his own car, who bought groceries with coupons, who had somehow ended up owning a condemned casino. Now they looked at him differently, with respect, with gratitude, with something that might have been pride. "This building isn't mine," Harold said into the microphone. "It belongs to all of you. It belongs to this community, to the kids who will learn here, the seniors who will gather here, the families who will celebrate here." He paused, his throat tight. "My wife and I came into some money. You all know the story. Hard to keep a secret in a small town." The crowd laughed. "But we never forgot where we came from. We never forgot what it feels like to struggle, to wonder if you're going to make it, to look at the future and see nothing but worry." His voice steadied. "This center is our way of saying that you're not alone, that someone sees you, that someone believes you're worth investing in." He looked at Edna, standing beside him. "My wife likes to say that we're building bridges instead of walls, so consider this the first brick." He raised the scissors. "Welcome to the Baker's Flat Community Center." The ribbon fell. The crowd cheered. And somewhere in the noise and celebration, Harold felt something shift inside him. For 79 years he'd been a fixer, someone who repaired what others had broken, who kept machines running so the world could keep moving. Invisible work, essential but unnoticed. But this was different. This was building, creating, leaving something behind that would outlast him. It felt like purpose. It felt like legacy. It felt like finally understanding what his life had been for. The news about Harold's health came without warning. It was a routine checkup, the kind he'd been having every 6 months since turning 70. Blood work, blood pressure, the usual questions. He'd felt fine. A little tired, maybe, but he was 80 years old. Tiredness came with the territory, but the doctor's face told him something was wrong before a single word was spoken. "Mr. Price, your blood work shows some concerning markers. I'd like to run some additional tests." The tests took 2 weeks. The results took another 3 days. Prostate cancer, stage 2. Treatable, the doctors said, but serious. Harold told Edna that evening, sitting on their back porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. She listened without interrupting, her face pale, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "What do we do?" she finally asked. "We fight it." Harold's voice was steady. "We've got the best doctors, the best treatment options. Money's not an issue anymore, and I've got too much left to do to let this stop me." Edna reached for his hand. "We fight it together. Always." The treatment was grueling. Surgery first, then radiation, then months of follow-up appointments and medications that left Harold exhausted and nauseated. There were days when he couldn't get out of bed, couldn't keep food down, couldn't do anything but lie there and wait for the sickness to pass. But he never stopped working. Even from his hospital bed, he reviewed grant applications. He called scholarship recipients to check on their progress. He dictated notes for the foundation's strategic plan while Edna wrote them down in her careful handwriting. "You're supposed to be resting," she scolded him one afternoon. "I'll rest when I'm dead." He smiled weakly. "And I'm not ready for that yet." The cancer went into remission in late November. The doctors called it a success. Complete response to treatment, no signs of active disease. They'd monitor him closely, of course. Regular scans, blood tests, the whole routine, but for now he was clear. Harold celebrated by returning to his Tradesmen's Guild classes. The teenagers cheered when he walked through the door, thinner and greyer than they remembered, but with the same steady hands and patient voice. "I heard you were sick," one of them said, a young man named Derek, who had been struggling with electrical work. "We were worried." "I was sick," Harold acknowledged, "but I got better. That's what you do when something breaks. You fix it, including yourself." He picked up a voltage meter and handed it to Derek. "Now, let's see if you've been practicing while I was gone." The third year of the foundation brought an unexpected honor. A letter arrived from the governor's office, informing Harold and Edna that they had been selected to receive the Nevada Distinguished Citizen Award, the state's highest civilian honor, recognizing individuals who had made extraordinary contributions to their communities. "This has to be a mistake," Edna said, reading the letter for the third time. "They give this to important people, politicians, CEOs, not retired maintenance workers." "Apparently they give it to us too." Harold was grinning. "Unless you want to send it back."
Don't you dare!
The ceremony was held in Carson City, in a grand hall with chandeliers and marble floors and more photographers than Harold had ever seen in one place. He wore a new suit, his first in 30 years, and Edna wore a blue dress that matched her eyes. The governor himself presented the award, reading from prepared remarks about Harold and Edna's discovery, their decision to cooperate with authorities, and the foundation they had built in the aftermath. "But what makes Harold and Edna Price truly remarkable," the governor said, "is not the money they found or the programs they funded. It's the character they demonstrated throughout. When they could have taken the easy path, they chose the right one. When they could have hidden behind lawyers and accountants, they stood up and told the truth. When they could have forgotten where they came from, they built a foundation to make sure no one else would be forgotten either." He turned to face them directly. "Harold and Edna, you represent the best of Nevada, the best of America, and on behalf of a grateful state, I am honored to present you with this award." The applause was thunderous. Cameras flashed, people rose to their feet, but Harold barely noticed. He was looking at Edna, at the tears streaming down her face, at the woman who had stood beside him through 56 years of marriage, through poverty and struggle and danger and triumph. She was the best thing that had ever happened to him, better than any award, any fortune, any recognition. And she was smiling. The demolition of the Silver Dust Casino took place on a bright morning in early spring. Harold and Edna stood at a safe distance, surrounded by family and friends and foundation board members, watching as the wrecking ball swung through the air and connected with the building that had changed their lives. The walls crumbled. Dust rose in great clouds. The structure that had stood for over 50 years, that had hidden a fortune and kept secrets for decades, collapsed in on itself like a house of cards. "Any regrets?" Marcus asked, standing beside his father. Harold shook his head. "That building was never ours, not really. It was just the place where we found something that was meant to be found. And now? Now we build something better." Construction began 3 months later. In place of the condemned casino, a new facility rose from the desert floor, the Ashford Memorial Center, named not for Victor Ashford, but for all the victims of his crimes. The center would house job training programs, addiction recovery services, and transitional housing for people getting back on their feet. It would be staffed by social workers, counselors, and volunteers from the community. And it would be free to anyone who needed it. "We're taking something that was built on exploitation and turning it into a place of healing," Rachel, the foundation's executive director, explained to reporters at the groundbreaking ceremony. "That's what the Price family wanted from the beginning, transformation, not just charity." Harold didn't speak at the ceremony. He didn't need to. He just stood beside Edna, watching the construction crews break ground, knowing that something meaningful would grow from this soil. Something that would help people the way he and Edna had once needed help. Something that would outlast them both. The 5th anniversary of the verdict arrived on a cold February morning. Harold was 83 years old now. His hair had gone completely white. His movements were slower, more deliberate. The cancer remained in remission, but he knew better than to take any day for granted. He and Edna celebrated quietly, with breakfast at Rosie's diner, the same booth, the same meatloaf, the same pie. 5 years, Edna said, stirring her coffee. It doesn't seem possible. A lot has happened. More than I ever imagined. She looked at him across the table, her eyes still sharp despite the years. Do you remember what you said that first night, after we found the vault? Harold thought back. It felt like a lifetime ago. I said we open it and find out what was worth hiding. Edna nodded. And we did. We found money and gold and secrets, but that wasn't what was really worth hiding. What do you mean? She reached across the table and took his hand. What was really hidden was us, who we could become, what we could do when we stopped just surviving and started actually living. Her voice was soft but certain. We were hiding too, Harold. Hiding behind our bills and our worries and our fear that things would never get better. And then that vault opened, and we had to decide who we really were. Harold felt his throat tighten. I'm proud of us, Edna continued. I'm proud of what we built. Not because of the money, but because of what we did with it. Because we stayed true to who we've always been. We did, he agreed. We really did. They finished their breakfast in comfortable silence. 2 old people in a corner booth, holding hands the way they had since they were young. Outside, the sun was rising over the desert. Another day beginning, another year ahead. And Harold realized, with a clarity that surprised him, that he wasn't afraid of what came next. He had spent his whole life fixing things, repairing what was broken, keeping the world running. But these past 5 years he had done something different, something better. He had built, not just buildings or programs or foundations. He had built hope. He had built opportunity. He had built a legacy that would continue long after he was gone. And that, he understood now, was what life was really about. Not the money you earned or the things you accumulated, but the difference you made, the lives you touched, the bridges you built instead of the walls. Edna squeezed his hand. Ready to go home? Harold smiled. Yeah, let's go home. They drove back through the desert as the morning warmed, past the site where the Ashford Memorial Center now stood, past the community center in Baker's Flat, past the community college where their scholarship recipients were building their futures. Every mile held a memory. Every landmark represented something they had helped create. And as Harold pulled into the driveway of their modest 3-bedroom ranch, he felt something he hadn't expected. Peace. Complete, unshakable peace. He had done what he set out to do. He had turned a dark fortune into a bright legacy. He had proved that ordinary people, people with nothing but grit and honesty and love, could change the world. Edna got out of the car and walked toward the front door, then paused and looked back at him. Coming? Harold nodded, climbing out slowly, his joints protesting the cold. Just taking a moment. She smiled. That smile he had fallen in love with 56 years ago, the one that still made his heart skip. Don't take too long. I'm making pancakes. He laughed. Yes, ma'am. He stood in the driveway for another minute, looking at the house they had chosen. Not a mansion, not an estate, just a home. Their home. Built on love, built on trust, built on 56 years of choosing each other every single day. That was the real fortune, Harold realized. Not the $47 million, not the foundation or the scholarships or the community center. The real fortune was this, was her, was them. Everything else was just bonus. He walked toward the front door, toward the smell of pancakes and the sound of Edna humming in the kitchen, toward the rest of his life, however long that might be. And as he stepped inside and closed the door behind him, he knew, with absolute certainty, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Home. Finally, completely home. Harold Price passed away on a quiet Sunday morning in October, 6 years after he and Edna first opened the doors of the Silver Dust Casino.
He went peacefully, in his sleep, with Edna beside him, holding his hand the way she had for 57 years. The funeral was held at the Baker's Flat Community Center, the building he had helped create, filled with the people whose lives he had touched. They came by the hundreds. Scholarship recipients, Tradesmen's Guild graduates, foundation staff, neighbors and friends and strangers who had only known Harold through the programs he'd funded. Marcus delivered the eulogy. "My father spent 83 years on this earth," he said, his voice steady despite his grief. "And for most of those years, nobody noticed. He fixed things in the background. He kept the world running while everyone else got the credit." He paused, looking out at the packed room. But in the last 6 years of his life, he became something different. Not because he changed who he was, but because he finally had the chance to show it. He showed us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that it's never too late to build something meaningful, that the measure of a life isn't what you accumulate, but what you give away. Marcus's voice cracked. "My father found a fortune hidden in a basement, but the real treasure was already there, inside him, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be shared." He looked at his mother, sitting in the front row, her silver hair pinned up the way it had been every day since Marcus could remember. "Dad always said he married up, and he was right. But Mom, you also married well. You married a man who never forgot where he came from, who never stopped believing in the goodness of people, who spent his final years proving that one person, one ordinary, stubborn, generous person, can change the world." The room was silent except for soft weeping. "Rest easy, Dad. You've earned it." Edna survived Harold by 3 years. She continued running the foundation, working alongside Rachel and Marcus to expand its programs and deepen its impact. She visited scholarship recipients. She attended community center events. She wrote personal letters to everyone who received a grant, thanking them for being part of Harold's legacy. And every Tuesday and Thursday, she drove to the Tradesmen's Guild and sat in the back of the classroom, watching the students learn the skills her husband had spent his life mastering. "She doesn't say much," one of the instructors told a reporter who came to do a story on the program. "She just sits there and smiles. But the kids love having her around. It's like she's watching over them." Edna passed away on a spring morning, 82 years old, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. Her funeral was even larger than Harold's. The governor attended. State senators sent flowers. The mayor declared it a day of remembrance in Baker's Flat. But what mattered most to the family were the ordinary people who came. The scholarship recipients who had graduated and started careers. The small business owners who had received grants. The seniors who had found community. The young people who had learned trades. They filled the community center to overflowing, spilling out into the parking lot, sharing stories about the woman who had served them lunch and believed in them. Linda delivered the eulogy this time. "My mother spent 31 years in school cafeterias," she said. "She fed thousands of children, day after day, year after year. Most of them never knew her name. She was just the lady with the hairnet, the one who smiled and gave them an extra scoop of mashed potatoes." Linda paused. But in the last 9 years of her life, those children grew up. They came back, they remembered, and they told her what that extra scoop meant, what that smile meant, what it felt like to have someone see you when you thought you were invisible. Her voice softened. "My mother and father didn't set out to change the world. They just bought a broken-down casino because they wanted to leave something behind. But what they left behind was so much more than money. They left behind proof that kindness matters, that honesty matters, that staying true to yourself, even when no one's watching, matters most of all." She looked at the crowd. "If you're here today because my parents helped you, I have one request: pay it forward. Find someone who's struggling and offer them a hand. See someone who's invisible and let them know they matter. Build bridges instead of walls." She smiled through her tears. That's what Harold and Edna would have wanted.
That's their legacy, and it lives on in every single one of you. The Price Family Foundation continues to this day. Marcus serves as chairman of the board, a position he plans to hold until his own children are ready to take over. Linda remains actively involved, flying out from Chicago for quarterly meetings and special events. The grandchildren, now adults themselves, have each found their own ways to contribute. One manages the scholarship program, another oversees the Tradesmen's Guild, a third handles community outreach. The Ashford Memorial Center has helped over 4,000 people in its first 5 years of operation. The Bakers Flat Community Center hosts events nearly every day of the week. The scholarships have funded education for hundreds of students who otherwise couldn't afford it. And every year, on the anniversary of the court verdict that changed everything, the family gathers at the small cemetery outside Henderson, where Harold and Edna are buried, side by side, beneath a simple headstone. The inscription reads, "Harold and Edna Price, partners in life, partners in giving. They built bridges instead of walls. They lay flowers on the grave. They share memories. They laugh and cry and hold each other close. And then they go back to work, because that's what Harold and Edna would have wanted. Not mourning, not monuments, just the quiet, steady work of making the world a little bit better than they found it. One scholarship at a time, one grant at a time, one life at a time. Anyone can change the world if they're stubborn enough to keep trying and brave enough to do what's right, even when it's hard." Harold and Edna Price were ordinary people. They had no special talents, no powerful connections, no advantages that set them apart. They just had each other and the courage to open a door that everyone else was afraid of. What they found behind that door changed their lives. But more importantly, it revealed who they already were: honest, generous, determined, kind. The money didn't make them good people. It just gave them the chance to show it. And that's the real lesson of their story. You don't need a fortune to make a difference. You don't need recognition or power or fame. You just need to decide what kind of person you want to be and then be that person every day in every choice until the end of your life. Harold and Edna did that. And look what they built. Imagine what you could build too. The end. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Tomorrow, we have 2 more incredible stories waiting for you. Just click on one of them now, and let's keep this journey going together.